that are commonly used here in DC, and remind you all how a bill becomes a law, and end with a discussion about how advocates can impact that process and why relationships matter. So if we go to the next slide, please. We do have a few housekeeping notes. If everyone would please mute their lines and turn their cameras off, we can get started into the content. Also want to make sure to note that, as you all probably just heard, this meeting is being recorded, and the recording and all materials, including slides, will be shared with all registrants afterwards. If you do have any questions at all, please feel free to click that chat button, type your question. Grassroots staff are monitoring and are able to answer any questions or concerns. So that being said, I think we can jump right into the presentation. We'll start with the basics and go into some of the more nuanced terms that you've likely heard about on the news or in some of our alerts. I'll be honest that people that live and work in DC tend to throw these terms around as if they're parts of everyday conversation. I'm certainly guilty of that myself, so I hope this gives you a better understanding of how things work in DC, and hope that it makes you understand some of our action alerts and why we are asking you to take action. So with that, I'll start slowly and simply. Congress. This just simply refers to the U.S. House of Representatives and the United States Senate. The next acronym, MOCs, is one that you hear and see from me quite often. This just stands for Member of Congress, so either a representative or a senator, or that could be both, of course. The next key term here is a committee. And so a committee is a subgroup of MOCs in the House or Senate with specific areas of concern that prepare legislation. They conduct investigations in certain cases. And so while there are a lot of committees in Congress, in both the House and Senate, Year the Cure advocacy tends to focus on a select few that really have a big impact. So there are a few committees like the Senate Help Committee, the House Ways and Means Committee, Appropriations Committees, the Agriculture Committee. Those are just to name a few. Committees play a really major role in deciding whether a bill should continue on the legislative track or whether it should be abandoned. So they really do play a critical role in Congress. And now next slide. So moving on, a hearing is when a committee or a subcommittee hold a session with witnesses to testify on a specific bill or issue, trying to get more information to decide if they should continue to work on this issue. And this is the time that I want to highlight when Year the Cure advocates have really been able to play a critical role, both through timely online and offline engagement around hearings, but also we've had advocates that provide testimony to the committees. We've had mothers concerned about tobacco use, researchers that are asking the government to increase funding for medical research, and so on and so on. We've had folks come to DC and testify, and they always make a big splash. Committee hearings really are very important and one of the first steps you can make for legislation. So then the next step after a committee hearing, if a bill, they decide that it's something you should move forward with, is a markup. A markup, it's another term you've likely heard from us in emails, and this is when a committee debates, amends, and ultimately either votes to advance or halt the legislation. It's a key moment for bills' chances to become law, and something that we frequently see as an indicator for whether a bill can pass Congress or not. So think if a bill passes out of a markup with a strong bipartisan support, it's far more likely that that bill is going to then advance through the rest of the House or Senate than if it's highly partisan or only gets marked up by one vote, that sort of thing. So now, as we move on to the next slide, we're going to get into a little bit more of the nuanced terminology, but these are really important terms and acronyms, particularly in recent history. So this first one, a CR, I know you've heard from us about that. I assume you've heard it on the news as well. A CR is a continuing resolution. They're becoming increasingly common in the divided Congress of the last few years. So a CR, essentially it's legislation that funds existing government activities and programs when Congress has not been able to complete regular appropriations bills, so as they regularly scheduled. You've probably heard this term as a way to fund the government and avoid government shutdowns in recent years. So it comes up, wouldn't be surprised if it comes up again this year, but there are occasionally times when advocates have a chance to weigh in on a continuing resolution. So just wanted to highlight that one for you. The next term, really key, lobbying. It's definitely something you should know because you all do it so incredibly well. When you contact or meet with your MOCs, you are lobbying. Essentially, this is the act of attempting to influence policy, regulations, or laws. Your the Cure advocates truly are the best in the business at this, and they've lobbied for countless issues to help us lead longer and healthier lives. So thank you for all of your work on that. We really appreciate it. The next one I have here, I'm actually going to skip over this lame duck as it's not quite as relevant at the moment. So if we could go to the next slide, please. A conference, this is something that will likely come up in September, potentially into October, but more likely September, around transportation and infrastructure. And you've probably heard a lot about that in the news recently. This is when, so a conference is when representatives and senators come together to try to resolve differences in proposed legislation. An example of this might be, let's say the United States House of Representatives passed a bill that would increase NIH research funding by $2 billion, but the Senate version that they passed only had an increase for $1 billion. They would then conference this bill together and try to come to a compromise. You know, hopefully for our advocates, that would be that $2 billion number, and the Senate would be okay with it. But more often than not, it is a compromise. The next term, something you've definitely heard from us before, is a recess. So a recess is a time frequently around holidays and most often in August, when Congress adjourns and MOCs return home. They're definitely still working. They're not just home on vacation for months on end or weeks on end, nothing like that. But this is typically when they meet with constituents, local businesses, et cetera, and really focus on what's going on in their home state or district rather than holding hearings, voting on bills, advancing legislation. This is really a time to do the work that impacts their constituents directly. So, moving on, this last slide here definitely gets a bit more technical, but these are two terms that are frequently misunderstood, and many try to put either negative or positive spins on them depending upon what their motives are. I don't want to get too detailed here because I know your time is valuable, but they are essentially parliamentary procedures to either block or advance legislation, and primarily in the United States Senate. So really, these are just rules that were written in that allow for either block or advance legislation. So the first one I'll focus on is a filibuster. Again, you've probably heard this before. This is a tactic used in the Senate that will either delay or block legislation by the minority party. You may have seen this in movies. I think probably the most famous example of this is Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, but it's certainly been in the news if there's talk of trying to reform the filibuster. Historically, a filibuster was essentially when one person or a group of people would get together, they would stand and talk, they would read, they'd have conversations. Several times people have literally just read the phone book aloud. But the reason for that is to block a vote from happening in the Senate if you are in the minority party and don't have the party votes to do it through voting alone. The next term, again, this is a big one, and you're probably hearing a lot about this, and we'll continue to hear a lot about it over the next week or two. Very important because it's so often used by both Republicans and Democrats to pass oftentimes very large and potentially politically divisive bills when they have narrow majorities. So reconciliation, so that you know, can only be used on certain pieces of legislation and can override the filibuster rules to pass legislation with a simple majority vote. So this is a reconciliation is something that can be used to block the filibuster. So you can use this to pass legislation either with a simple majority vote or by using the vote of the vice president as a tiebreaker, as they do serve as the president of the Senate. This has been front and center in the news since the Georgia Senate elections. And as I mentioned, you'll likely be hearing more about this in the next few weeks. But I did want to note that, just highlight for everyone, since it does require a simple majority vote, 51 votes is all that would be required to pass a bill in the Senate using reconciliation. We can move to the next slide. But I want to focus on how a bill actually becomes a law. And the first thing to note is that it is incredibly hard to pass a bill on the federal level. As you can see on the notes on the slides here, on average, more than 10,000 bills are introduced per session. And there have been plenty of sessions that actually had more than 15,000 bills introduced. On average, less than 2% are actually enacted into law. And so far during this current session, which has not even been a year, we are not even at 0.5%. So it really makes it very hard to pass a law on the national level. But You're the Cure advocates have truly had an outsized impact on this because you are so passionate and you're so good about sharing your stories about why these policies that you contact them on actually matter to you. So evidence to that, as you can see in the slide, is that in our last fiscal year alone, we actually had 43 federal policy and regulatory wins. That's 43 wins. That's truly unheard of, and thanks in large part to your efforts. So in all honesty, give yourself a pat on the back, a round of applause, because 43 wins it's incredible. We could move to the next slide, please. This is essentially this is a diagram that essentially does what the Schoolhouse Rock, I'm Just a Bill on Capitol Hill song did, but this is an updated image, if you will. This really explains the race to the finish for a bill. So first, you would start with writing the bill, and writing the bill can come from members of Congress. It can come from staff. It can even come from constituents like you. It's absolutely not unheard of to have a constituent draft the first version of a bill, and then it would get edited, but it is not unheard of in a way that you can, impact. So then an MOC, or hopefully a group of members of Congress, would introduce the bill, which is then referred to the committees that we mentioned before. So it would be referred to a committee that focuses on the issues the bill is trying to address. Once that bill is in the committee, there are usually hearings, but only if they decide to hold hearings on it, they can block it. So once they have a hearing, likely in the subcommittee, then goes to a full committee. If all goes well, there would be a markup to advance the bill. The next step on its path to the finish line would be it goes to either the full House or the full Senate, where in the Senate specifically, you'd be debating, in the House, you'd be offering amendments. Ultimately, you would vote on this bill. If it's a House bill, then it would get reported to the, If it is a House bill, it would get reported to the Senate to begin the process anew. If they have not already started on it, but if both the House and the Senate do have similar bills that are not identical, that is when you would come into that conference that I mentioned before, when they'd get together to try to come to a compromise. However, if all is okay with this bill and both the House and Senate do pass the bill, it would advance to the president's desk for signature. And then once that happens, depending on the subject of the bill, it could potentially move to agencies for regulatory review. So an example of this would be, let's say we succeeded in something we've been trying to for several years now, and we got a bill passed by the House and Senate that is going to remove flavored tobacco products from the marketplace. And the president signed this bill. This hypothetical bill would then go to the Food and Drug Administration so that they could do some final rules on this, procedures for setting those regulations that are specified in the bill, things like that. But so that's just an example of how it would end up getting to an agency as opposed to just, hey, this is now the law. So, and I did see that there are some questions in the chat box. We can definitely provide this slide for everyone, and someone can feel free to put my direct email in the chat box. I'm happy to answer any and all questions after the presentation. But since we've gone over all this before, if we could go to the next slide, I'd just like to introduce our special guest, who's going to have a discussion about how advocates like you can impact this process. So allow me to introduce the Director of Grassroots Advocacy and a true expert in this field, Amy Schoep-Manzi. Amy, thanks so much for joining us.
Dave, thanks for the invitation and for all the folks who put together this chat series. I'm so excited to spend some time with a great group of advocates today. I see a lot of longtime advocates in our participant list, and I see you, Mr. Pepper, a member of our National Advocacy Coordinating Committee, and Connie, calling yourself a senior advocate. I don't know about the word senior, but a longtime, incredibly valuable advocate to us. So I appreciate all the friends, old and new, that are on the list and joined us today.
Okay, well, so now we've got these introductions out of the way. I think I have my first question. I think probably one we're all asking ourselves is, how can we as advocates impact the legislative process?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think we want to hop back in our slides. We're not quite ready for the pop quiz, but we'll come to it. Now you all know there's going to be a pop quiz, so prepare yourselves. So Dave, that's a great question. We know from years of data gathered from surveys of congressional staff and members of Congress, the folks who work on Capitol Hill, that citizen advocacy is one of the most impactful things, the most, in fact, impactful thing in swaying members of Congress and their decisions on pieces of legislation. So there's a group called the Congressional Management Foundation that works on citizen advocacy and understanding all the inner workings of that relationship. And when they have asked, what is the most effective tool in helping you make a decision, if you haven't already come to a decision on an issue, they routinely cite the high impact of communication from their constituents. So I can't stress enough how important it is that members of Congress hear from the people who live in their districts, the people who vote them in and out of office, the people that they represent. So that's the first part of it. And I'd also say there are a couple of ways that advocate input is so important. First, as a collective, it's really important that we deliver the voice of patients, of heart and stroke patients, of folks who care deeply about the health of our communities. And so when you're responding to things like our action alerts, sending through your emails, it's important that members are saying, oh, okay, I'm seeing that this is the voice of patient advocates, that they support this legislation or they oppose this legislation. The offices are counting up and watching to say the majority of our constituents are opposed to this law, or the majority of our constituents back in the district at home are supportive of this piece of legislation or this policy. And so as a collective, it's really important that we participate in that conversation and in that dialogue. Even if we know our members of Congress and we think that, they know I'm supportive, it's still important that we send those messages through again, because there's sort of a calculation happening in congressional offices to assess where the majority of their constituents are. Again, it's their job to represent us. And so they're very attuned to where their home district sits on a particular policy. So that's sort of the collective aspect of it. As an individual, our impact can be enormous. And you referenced this a little bit earlier as you were talking. That individual story can be the exact thing that propels one of our campaigns forward. It may be in sharing your story and the change that you really need for health and for access to care and for whatever it is in your community. That may be the thing that propels forward the introduction of a piece of legislation that matters to the Heart Association. It may be the thing that propels your individual member of Congress to carry that piece of legislation forward and through the process. You heard Dave talk about how very hard it is, and we cannot move a piece of legislation through the process without a legislative champion. And so when you're sharing your individual story and building that relationship, you may be creating that legislative champion, because they may be saying, I've talked to Bob and this issue is really important to him. His story really compelled me. I'm going to talk to my colleagues on the committee to help prod them to move this forward. I don't want this bill to die from inaction. And so as an individual, your story is so important. And as a collective, the fact that we deliver lots of messages that You're the Cure is a big voice, and that the patient community beyond You're the Cure is an even bigger voice, and being a part of that is really important.
Thanks for that, Amy. I don't think I've ever agreed with anything more. That's truly spot on. And we appreciate the thought on that. So my next question is about why you think it's so important for advocates to keep in regular touch with their lawmakers.
Yeah. The simple answer is we want AHA to be the trusted resource, one of their trusted resources. Anytime a member of Congress is looking at a policy that, or a federal regulator, I should say, this isn't restricted just to members of Congress, but anytime a policymaker in DC is looking at an issue that impacts patients, that impacts the care they receive, the care they can access, that impacts the general health of our communities, we want them to turn to the AHA for information, for our science base, for the patient stories, for all of you. We want them to come to us and say, what do you all think? We know you're the expert. And that isn't just the science expert, although that part's really important. It's also the patient experience expert. And that's where you all come in. And it's so important that you've built these relationships. You all, as our volunteers, are the face of the organization in your communities. When you share your story, when you build a relationship with your lawmaker, you are front of mind for them when they go to look at a policy. When you've built that relationship, we want them to see a policy come across their desk that's been introduced and say, I wonder what Nora would think, or I wonder how this policy would impact Philip with the issues he's been sharing with me. I'm going to reach out and touch base. And we really do have so many examples of advocates who've built that kind of relationship and who have that ongoing dialogue with their member of Congress. And that's what we want. We want AHA, we want all of you as our volunteers to be a trusted resource for members of Congress, to be able to have the access, because you've built a relationship when it's time to weigh in on a particular policy, that you can reach out and say, hey, I know this policy was just introduced. It's really important to me for this reason, or it would be damaging for this reason. So just being front of mind for lawmakers and establishing yourself and the AHA as a trusted resource for them, that's why this ongoing work that never seems to end is so, so important.
Thanks, Amy. And I really appreciate that distinction between, the scientists and the researchers, but the patient side of things and the role that both play and how critically important both are to us trying to progress a bill. So thank you. I think we've got time for one last question before we move on to the not quite so surprise pop quiz. I'd love to ask you to give our listeners some tips on how they can develop or maintain a relationship with the lawmakers, since, as you're saying, it really is so key to us achieving our goals.
Absolutely. So the first is to schedule a meeting. Remember that these folks are elected and in their position truly to represent you and the others in your community. So schedule a meeting, and in that meeting, introduce yourself, share your personal story, talk about why issues that affect heart or stroke patients or the health of your community are so important to you. And after that meeting, follow up. If in the course of that meeting there were questions asked, there were things that required follow-up, even if there weren't, send a thank you note and remind them of the things you care about. And I would say you are not doing this alone. You'll see in the chat box, all of our grassroots managers, our regional grassroots managers are introducing themselves. As you schedule that meeting to introduce yourself, to share your story, and please understand, just the sharing of that story and introducing yourself and building that relationship is so important. But in addition, our grassroots managers can tell you right now, federally, there's a piece of legislation that will do X or Y or Z, depending on the time of your meeting, and give you the talking points to carry forward into that meeting, give you a fact sheet or a one-pager or something to offer a policy ask, a vote yes or a support this proposal kind of ask to be the hook of your meeting. And so after, you can follow up, send an email, say, thank you so much for the time. I enjoyed our dialogue. As a reminder, I'm here to be a resource for you. Here's some additional information. So schedule a meeting, and then when one of our policy issues comes up in a few months, schedule another meeting. Continue to schedule meetings and have conversations. The next tip, so schedule meetings and follow up on them, and rely on your grassroots staff partners to help supply information and things you may need for that meeting. The next is to say hello in the community. When you're out at a parade, when you're in the grocery store, when you see them at community events, say hello, reintroduce yourself. Hello, I'm Amy. I really enjoyed our meeting to talk about this particular issue. How is that proposal moving? Has there been any progress? Say hello in the community. Remember that members of Congress represent the folks in their district. They are quite accustomed to this, and it is part of building an ongoing relationship. So say hello, reintroduce yourself, engage with them when they're at community events. And the third is to attend their community events. So when they host a town hall, when they host a community forum while they're home in August, so many members of Congress host town hall meetings or telephone town halls. Obviously, we're doing things virtually to stay safe at this time, but participate in their community dialogues, however they're hosting them, and raise the issues that are important to you and important to the Heart Association in those forums. And it all comes down to just communicating regularly. It's not so different from building and maintaining a friendship or another professional relationship. It just comes down to being present and continuing to communicate, being respectful and responsive, and all those things we do in our regular relationship maintenance. So schedule meetings, say hello in the community, engage in their events and forums, and continue just a regular cycle of communication.
Thank you, Amy. I think those are really great tips. And just a reminder to folks, we are going to share these slides and the recording. So if you weren't able to capture all of that incredibly valuable information, don't worry, we're going to send you a copy of it. So thanks again for joining, Amy. I think it's time to move on to that pop quiz now. So the first question here will be, when using reconciliation, how many votes are needed in the Senate to advance the bill? You all can take a second and type it in the chat box if you'd like. Well, I'm glad to see that that you all were listening. Both majority or 51 is the correct answer there. So thank you. Thank you. Sharon, 60 votes are required when not using reconciliation. That would be to overcome the filibuster. So you're absolutely not wrong. But I'm very impressed that so many people got this right. So the next question is, despite the challenges, because we all know how hard it is to get a bill passed federally, how many federal legislative and regulatory victories can Year the Cure advocates claim in the last fiscal year? So this is the total number of wins that we're claiming. Yeah, and I see a few people, plenty of people are getting that right. Yep, the answer is 43. I wish it were 59 or like some of the other folks said, but 43 is truly an outstanding number that is very much in large part thanks to all the work that you do. So thanks for indulging me in those quiz questions here. So I just want to focus on a few key takeaways before we let you all leave. As I mentioned, advancing federal legislation is incredibly challenging, but as long as we have engaged Year the Cure advocates, we really can make a difference, and we do always have a chance. Another takeaway would be that developing relationships with your lawmakers truly matter, and that your grassroots managers are here to help. I always like to say this, Year the Cure advocates truly are the best in the business. 43 wins, not possible without you. And the last would be, don't forget to join our regional office hours with your grassroots managers immediately after this presentation. Another reminder that I would like to give you is that, as I stated in the beginning, that this Relentless Together is a series of trainings, and that we will have our next event at the same time next Tuesday, 1:30 p.m. Eastern. The topic, as you can see, is improving Americans' eating habits, and we will have another special guest to talk about the important work being done in Washington. So we hope that you will all join us next week. Thank you for being with us today, for being such incredible advocates, and you all have a great rest of the day.